Our scripture this morning comes from the Gospel according to Luke, and it is the assigned scripture in the lectionary for today. So it's Luke chapter 14, verse 1, and then we skip to verse 7 through 14. Listen now for the Word of God. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Contemplating this passage from Luke, we would like to think that these social issues are descriptions of the first century world of the New Testament and not problems in our own church settings, especially churches rooted in Western democratic society. Yet, social distinctions do matter far too often in our Christian communities, as those who experience less privilege would easily attest. What was quite explicit in the ancient world may express itself in more implicit fashion in our current context. In Luke, the social matrix of first century life is on display, and we hear Jesus speak into this context both with communal wisdom and unexpected, even astonishing advice. We hear the setting for the story in verse 1. It is the Sabbath, and Jesus is invited to a meal at the house of a leading Pharisee. After an interlude in which Luke narrates Jesus healing a man and defending that Sabbath healing, Luke focuses on the meal scene, a setting the writer strategically employs in this gospel. At the meal, Jesus observes in verse 7 how the guests chose the places of honor. His response, according to Luke, is twofold. First, he tells a parable. The point of the story is to discourage his listeners from seeking the most prestigious seats at the table, to avoid the humiliating situation of being displaced by someone of greater prominence. Instead, they are to take the lowest place so that they might be elevated to a more honorable seat by their host. Jesus' summary comment to the parable is the well-known aphorism, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." understand this first response of Jesus to the very explicit social ranking at meals. We might note initially that such social ranking was commonplace in the Greco-Roman society. In fact, meals were situations that particularly highlighted social disparities in the first century world. There is a store of advice given about how to act at such meals. A Jewish wisdom book, Sirach, warns of being greedy and advises being deferential at such meals. While this advice fits the tone of Jesus' remarks in Luke, Jesus goes further in warning against seeking out the most honorable seats. His exhortation is to pursue humility, a concept with significant status connotations. Humility was very rarely considered a virtue in Greco-Roman moral discourse. Yet humility is to mark the followers of Jesus, according to so much of the New Testament witness. What might be striking to our contemporary mindset in this first teaching of Jesus is that he does not criticize the system of honor at meals. Instead, he seems to assume it. Highest and lowest seats figure into his answer. This may be due to his particular audience in the story, the banquet guests at the Pharisees' house. Jesus' advice addresses how to navigate the social setting into which they have been invited. When we move down to verses 12 through 14, however, we have a more countercultural message, one that addresses the fabric of the honor and status structures of the ancient world. Jesus, without using a parable, speaks directly to his host, the one who holds a greater measure of control over the rules of the game for this particular meal. His advice to this figure of power in the story works to undermine the very system that upholds status difference at meals. Jesus exhorts the host not to invite friends, family, or the rich to meals, since they are able to repay with a corresponding invitation. Such social reciprocity is the backbone of the patronage system endemic to the first century world. Instead, Jesus calls for inclusion of those who cannot return the invitation: the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. This group of persons resonates with the Isaiah-shaped mission of Jesus from Luke chapter 4, which says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, release to the captives, to give sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free." For Luke, Jesus subverts expectations that social payment and repayment should govern life in God's kingdom community. His promise is that God will repay such hospitality at the resurrection of the righteous. What might Luke 14 have to say to us today? There is a theological truth that undergirds this passage and its very tangible social network and exhortations. And that is that as God's people humble themselves and seek to live by a different social system marked by radical inclusion, they can trust God to be faithful and to reward their right ways of living in that final day, that resurrection of the righteous. Yet, the final day piece should not overshadow how the text speaks powerfully to the way in which the kingdom Jesus inaugurates already subverts subverts human social systems. As Christ followers, we are charged with living out the countercultural value of inclusion for the most marginalized of our society. Our actions should mirror Jesus' own inclusive kingdom agenda so that no one is left out of God's loving reach. Today's gospel lesson has been whirling in my head this week as I have reflected on this congregation. And so I want to share a few of these thoughts with you now. You may not be aware of this yet, but we have secured the funds to have our new church sign installed due to the generosity of this congregation. So thank you and woo for us, right? Woo, yeah. The session is very excited about being able to let the community of Murray know who we are and what we are doing. Our hope is that this contemporary marketing tool will help us grow this congregation. And I want to take this moment to say something that I hope everyone already knows, but it won't hurt to say it out loud. We have been talking a lot about church growth in recent days. We even have a special task force on the future, as well as a long-standing committee dedicated to the end of church growth, or to church growth. The church, and I mean the church universal, our congregation along with every other one on this planet, does not exist just to exist. Let me say that again. We do not exist just to exist. We don't want to grow just because we want to keep being able to pay the light bill years into the future. There are a couple of broad reasons why the church exists. First of all, we exist in order to live out the Great Commission. We exist in order to help people cultivate a relationship with the divine, with God, with holy mystery. We exist in order to share God's love, grace, and unconditional acceptance with all people. So we exist in order to make disciples that follow the way of Jesus of Nazareth, whom we know as Christ. Secondly, we exist in order to live in communion, in community. One question that I get asked quite a bit is, why be a part of a church when I am perfectly able to be spiritual on my own? Now, I do not deny that we are perfectly able to work on our relationship with God independently of other people. I hope that we all do that to some extent. The reason we should be a part of a community is because it is only within community that we have our best shot at understanding love, grace, and forgiveness at their deepest levels. In community, we walk with one another through the dark valleys of grief, pain, illness, loss, loneliness. In community, we walk with one another and celebrate together the joys of this life. The birth of a child, new love, love shared over a lifetime, life's various milestones, and so much more. In community, we grow spiritually. Folks who are further along in their spiritual journey help those who are just beginning to learn about God's love. Those who are seasoned in the faith challenge one another and therefore have their discipleship mutually deepened. Community, at least when it is healthy, teaches us how to work through conflict so that we are better people on the other side of it. Community teaches us to value diversity because it helps us to broaden our worldview and undermines our limited assumptions. In some, human religious community works to reflect the perfect community found within the holy communion of God, Christ, and the Spirit. The preacher, Will Willimon, tells a story that puts this morning's gospel lesson into action. He says, I know a church that had fallen on hard times. Their membership had dwindled. They had attempted to attract new people to church, particularly young families, but with little response. Then their young pastor challenged them. Don't invite your neighbors or relatives to come with you to church. Invite someone whom you don't know that well. Invite someone who is having a rough time right now. And don't say to them, I want you to come to church with me and meet some people I think you will like. Say to them, we need you to help make us the church that Jesus intends us to be. Say to them, your presence among us could make us a better group of Jesus followers. Then the pastor added, isn't there someone of your acquaintance who has just lost someone they love? How about someone who is without her job and is anxious about her future? Or do you know someone who has been hurt by someone else? Invite them. Tell them we don't want them to go through their difficulties alone. Tell them we want to hear their story and we want to walk with them and bear some of their burdens. Fortunately for us, there are a lot of hurting folks out there, and there's a lot of loneliness in our town, said that young pastor. And their church grew. The pastor remarked, we have been trying to reach people who already had too much to do and too little time. People who were overprogrammed and very busy. The key was to look for people who have nothing better to do on a Sunday morning than to be with us and to be with Christ. I know. As Presbyterians, it really is a challenge to go out and invite people to church. We cringe at the word evangelism. But folks, it is what we are called to do. Not because people don't go to church need saving, but because they and we need community. Community that strives to reflect the great love and inclusion of Jesus of Nazareth. Because it is actually within community that we